Subcommittee on National Security would come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. The right to practice your religion freely is one of the cornerstone freedoms we have in our country. In fact, demonstrating its importance, freedom of religion is in the very First Amendment of the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Other countries take a narrower view of freedom of religion. Some impose an official religion, while others actively persecute those practicing a disfavored religion. We are pleased to have here today witnesses from the State Department, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent bipartisan government agency charged with monitoring the religious environment overseas, the president of Religious Freedom Institute, and a witness from the nonprofit group Human Rights First. In the State Department's most recent annual report on international religious freedom, the Department noted the U.S. government promotes religious freedom because countries that effectively safeguard this human right are more stable, economically vibrant, and peaceful. The failure of governments to protect these rights breeds instability, terrorism, and violence. Looking at countries with more restrictive religious practices, one sees that many of them have significant national security concerns. One commentator, former high-level State Department and NSC official, surveyed a number of conflicts in U.S. history and noted, quote, including World War II, every major war the United States has fought over the past 70 years has been against an enemy that also violated religious freedom. As examples, he pointed to Nazi Germany, North Korea, North Vietnam, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, as well as other sub-war conflicts, including the Cold War standoff with Soviet communism. The subcommittee is interested in hearing about the correlation between national security risks and restrictions on the freedom of religion abroad. We had a hearing on this issue in 2014, and there have been some developments since then. Just last December, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act. That law amended the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, which made clear that international religious freedom is a national security issue. The Wolf Act contemplates using a whole-of-government approach, including our national security agencies, to encourage religious freedom abroad. One way we can do this is already enshrined in federal law, allowing the denial of a visa to come into the United States for a foreign government official responsible for particularly severe violations of religious freedom. To help Congress and the American people better understand religious freedom abroad, both the State Department and USCIRF produce annual reports discussing countries' levels of religious freedom. By law, state is required to designate countries of particular concern. State's deadline this year is in mid-November, and I'm eager to see which countries are designated. The report listed countries of particular concern, but it also listed terrorist entities like the Islamic State, the Taliban, and al-Shabaab. It goes without saying that those entities are hostile to the free exercise of religion and pose national security risks to the American people. Looking at the USCIRF's list of countries of particular concern, there are a number of which are potential national security threats, including China, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, and Syria, among others. To help the United States mission to enable religious freedom worldwide, the International Religious Freedom Act required the appointment of a Senate-confirmed ambassador. President Trump nominated former Senator and current Governor of Kansas, Sam Brownback, for the position, and he has had his confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just last week. As this subcommittee discussed during the 2014 hearing, the ambassador position sat vacant for extended stretches during the Obama administration. It is important that the Senate move quickly to confirm Governor Brownback. The world must know that the United States takes its role seriously as a world leader in promoting religious freedom. Now, testifying today from the State Department is Ambassador Michael Kozak, a senior advisor for democracy, human rights, and labor. Also testifying is Christina Arriaga, who serves as vice chair on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Joining us as well is Professor Thomas Farr, who is president of the Religious Freedom Institute, the director, Religious Freedom Research Project at Georgetown University, and associate professor of the practice of Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Finally, we have Rod Brzezinski, a senior vice president of policy at Human Rights First. I want to thank the witnesses for their attendance. I look forward to your testimony today, and at this point, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. like to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the progress of U.S. government efforts to promote international religious freedom. I'd also like to welcome and thank our panel of witnesses this morning for its willingness to come and help this committee with its work. The U.S. framework to address international religious persecution is based on our shared commitment to advancing religious freedom as a fundamental and inalienable human right. It also recognizes that the protection of religious freedom abroad is critical to our national security. As recently stated by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, this is a quote, "Where religious freedom is not protected, we know that instability, human rights abuses, and violent extremism have a greater opportunity to take root," close quote. Similarly, the independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom underscores that religious freedom is a vital element of national security and critical to ensuring a more peaceful, prosperous, and stable world. In furtherance of these objectives, the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department monitors religious persecution and discrimination worldwide and releases an annual report detailing the status of international freedom in each country. The office also identifies, and this is a particular term to the study, countries of particular concern for subsequent designation by the Secretary of State given their severe violations of religious freedom. In announcing the first annual report on religious freedom issued under the Trump administration in August of 2017, Secretary Tillerson highlighted the particular threat posed by the terrorist group known as ISIS as a result of its genocidal activities targeting Yazidis, Christians, Shia Muslims, and other religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq and Syria. This latest report also notes that 10 nations were rightfully designated as countries of particular concern. Those have been listed by my colleague, the chairman, in October of 2016, including, again, North Korea, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia. As the State Department continues its work to identify countries of particular concern for 2017, the Office of International Religious Freedom should coordinate with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Congress has statutorily authorized this bipartisan and independent commission to conduct its own oversight in this area and develop policy recommendations to further inform the State Department's designation process. Importantly, the commission has strongly recommended that the State Department add 6 countries to its list for 2017 due to their perpetration or tolerance of systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. Chief among these additional countries is Russia. This year, in fact, marks the first time that the Commission has recommended Russia as a country of particular concern in light of its continued religious freedom violations in the Russian mainland, as well as activities in Ukraine and Crimea. According to the Commission's 2017 annual report, Russia presents a unique case in religious persecution as the sole state to have not only continually intensified its repression of religious freedom, but also to have expanded its repressive policies to the territories of a neighboring state by means of military invasion and occupation. The repressive policies implemented by the Russian government include administrative harassment, arbitrary imprisonment, and extrajudicial killing, as well as the enactment of new laws in 2016 that criminalize all non-government sanctioned private religious speech. Moreover, the Russian Supreme Court recently upheld a Justice Ministry order calling for the liquidation of the Jehovah's Witnesses denomination and prohibiting its operations as a so-called extremist organization. Russian security forces also continue to subject minority Muslim groups to fabricated terrorism charges, kidnappings, and disappearances. I strongly believe that the State Department should accept the Commission's recommendation and add Russia to the designation list. Reports of religious persecution and intolerance in Russia are not at all surprising, considering the impunity with which the Russian government continues to conduct itself on the world stage. In January 2017, our nation's intelligence community issued an unclassified and unprecedented high-confidence assessment that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign aimed at the 2016 U.S. presidential election. This malicious campaign included cyber breaches and other covert intelligence operations, as well as nefarious efforts undertaken by Russian government agencies, state-sanctioned media, and even paid social media users to spread Russian-desired messaging and to interfere in the election. To date, our committee has not held a hearing to examine that intelligence community-wide assessment that Russia attempted to undermine our national security and compromise the very foundation of our democratic process. In closing, I just want to say that I am very happy that the name of Frank Wolf was resurrected in today's hearing. I had a wonderful part of my tenure serving with Frank Wolf, and I know he represented the 10th Congressional District in Virginia. It's great that we're carrying on the work of such a great champion of religious freedom. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to discussing these and other issues with today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. I have introduced the witnesses in my opening statement, but just for the record, we do have Ambassador Kozak, we have Christina Arriaga, we have Dr. Farr, and we have Mr. Brzezinski. So we appreciate you all being here. Thank you. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you can all please rise, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows your remaining time. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking. And with that, I would like to recognize Ambassador Kozak for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For you and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing to focus attention on international religious freedom, a cherished American value, a universal human right, and a Trump administration foreign policy priority. As you mentioned, President Trump has nominated Governor Brownback to be the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Amongst his other accomplishments, he's co-authored 2 books on the subject, and as senator was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act. We could not ask for a more distinguished nominee. President Trump has stated that the United States looks forward to a day when people of all faiths, Christians and Muslims and Jewish and Hindu, can follow their hearts and worship according to their conscience. Vice President Pence has said, under President Trump, America will continue to stand for religious freedom of all people of all faiths across the world. In August, Secretary Tillerson mentioned that conditions in many parts of the world are far from ideal. As was mentioned, he stated that ISIS is clearly responsible for genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims, and is responsible for crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. The United States' efforts to help include our leadership of the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Coalition-backed forces have liberated more than 3/4 of the territory ISIS once controlled in Iraq and about 2/3 of the territory it once controlled in Syria. ISIS has not regained control of any of this territory, due in part to the coalition's work to stabilize liberated communities. But more robust steps must be taken in coming months so that Iraq's religious minority communities can provide for their own security. We continue to support the Iraqi government's efforts to enhance local government and establish local security forces. Stabilization projects in Iraq include minorities ISIS targeted for genocide. In Sinjar district, a predominantly Yazidi area, the UN Development Program has completed the rehabilitation of the Sununi Hospital and Primary Health Clinic, 7 schools, and 7 water wellheads and pumps, and has more projects planned for later this year. In the historic Christian town of Bartala, trained explosive ordnance disposal teams have cleared schools, medical facilities, and other key infrastructure. These efforts are setting up conditions for displaced people to voluntarily return to their home. We will ensure stabilization assistance reaches all liberated areas as quickly as possible. Our Bureau is working on programs that empower minorities to advocate on issues such as key pieces of legislation. Programs also promote stabilization efforts, more equitable and representative political participation, and access to services and governance structures. These programs engage the majority as well as minority communities, recognizing that preservation of ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq cannot be sustained without support and understanding of their value within mainstream Iraqi society. Global concern, another global concern is our work to reform discriminatory laws that deprive many of their ability to exercise their religious belief. Iran, for example, has 20 individuals executed in 2016 on charges that included waging war against God. Members of the Baha'i community are in prison for abiding their beliefs. In Saudi Arabia, the government does not recognize the right of non-Muslims to practice their religion in public and has used prison sentences, lashings, fines for apostasy, atheism, blasphemy, and insulting the state's interpretation of Islam. In Turkey, non-Sunni Muslims face discrimination and violence. The United States continues to advocate for the immediate release of Pastor Andrew Brunson, who has been wrongfully imprisoned there. In Bahrain, the government continued to target Shia clerics, and members of the community were discriminated against in government employment, education, and the justice system. In China, the government tortures, detains, and imprisons thousands for practicing their religious beliefs. In Pakistan, 24 people are on death row or life imprisonment for blasphemy. And in Sudan, the government arrests and intimidates clergy. We appreciate the committee raising the connection between the state of international religious freedom and America's national security. Our efforts to defend religion and belief is in our national interest. Places where religious freedom is denied, left unattended, can become full-blown security crises with effects far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Mass migration caused by persecution can be destabilizing, and resentment born of discrimination and persecution for one's faith can create a fertile ground for radicalization to violence and terrorist recruitment. In closing, I would note that the International Freedom Act calls on our government to stand for liberty and stand with the persecuted, to use and implement appropriate tools in the United States foreign policy apparatus, including diplomatic, commercial, charitable, educational, and cultural channels, to promote respect for religious freedom by all. We appreciate that these issues have always had strong bipartisan support, and we want to work closely with Congress to help persecuted minorities. Thank you again for holding this hearing to review the U.S. role in protecting international religious freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Arriaga, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Christina Arriaga. I'm the Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Today, I'd like to offer 3 observations which I explore more fully in my written testimony. Thanks for accepting it, for the record. Number 1, we ignore religious freedom at our own peril. The U.S. government must factor into its foreign policy religious freedom, a foundational human right, a source of peace, stability, and economic vitality, and a key factor in countries worldwide. For example, those whose religious freedom have been violated can become susceptible to extremist indoctrination, and governments that commit violations or allow them to occur with impunity often sow the seeds of their own instability. Number 2, some view religion as competition or as an alternate source of authority. This is dangerous to the United States. These countries use national security concerns to justify violating religious freedom. They pit groups against each other to enhance their own power. They allow violators to act with impunity, and they incite vigilante groups and others to violence. However, by exercising control in these ways, governments in Russia, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, for example, create more instability, not enhance authority. Number 3, hit them where it hurts. No one who violates human rights in their own country should be granted a visa to come to this country. The U.S. government has tools to address religious freedom violations, including the 1998 IRFA, the 2016 Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and the Global Magnitsky Act. However, we must have the political will to use these tools, and that is sometimes where we can fall short. Congress plays an indispensable role, including by holding hearings, passing needed legislation, and appropriating ample funding, exercising oversight, focusing on accountability, continually creating and refining the tools needed to address challenges, including accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity, using your own bully pulpits to highlight violations, and advocating for those who are persecuted and detained. I will end by focusing on 2 issues dear to my heart: religious prisoners of conscience and women and religious freedom. I hope all members can support prisoners through the Tom Lantos Commission's Defending Freedoms Project, launched in conjunction with USERV and Amnesty International USA. To do our part, each one of us are advocating for a prisoner as part of our Religious Prisoner Conscience Project. I chose Fariba Kamalabadi, who is in Iran in prison simply because she's a Baha'i. Last week, during a U-Serve delegation visit to Turkey, Commissioner Sandra Jolly and I drove to the remote prison of Kiriklar to meet with Pastor Andrew Brunson. We were the first to see him besides his wife, attorney, and the consular officer. He has been imprisoned on fabricated charges. This picture, he doesn't look like this anymore. He's lost over 50 pounds. He has suffered tremendous psychological pressure, and we must continue to advocate for his immediate release. Finally, building lasting peace and security requires the participation of women. Especially during conflicts, women are often targeted for violence and discrimination, with religion or the excuse of religion used to disempower women. In fact, it is a betrayal of the very foundations of freedom of religion or belief whenever it's misused to justify inexcusable and harmful practices such as female genital mutilation, child brides, and forced conventions. Unfortunately, this practice has been exported. In our own country, there are 500,000 girls at risk for female genital mutilation. My written testimony ended by quoting Martin Luther King. Here, I would like to quote Yogi Berra, who said, "If you come to a fork in the road, take it." The United States must commit to travel the road of advocating for international religious freedom with determination, passion, and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Farr, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My message to you today is straightforward and hopeful. Advancing religious freedom more successfully in our foreign policy can help the victims of religious persecution abroad and increase the security of the American people. But if we're to succeed, we will need to change some of our thinking and strengthen some of our programs at the State Department. Growing evidence indicates that religious freedom can undermine religion-related terrorism. The evidence applies to violence that emanates from any religion, but the primary threat to U.S. national security and that of most other nations, especially Muslim-majority nations, is Islamist terrorism. Our approach to terrorism as a religious freedom issue has understandably focused on the minority religious groups victimized by the terrorists or by governments. The methods historically used by the State Department to address religious persecution consist in large part of annual reports and annual designations of the worst violators. The International Religious Freedom Act also authorized economic sanctions. These reports are important. They're vitally important. They're generally accurate and reliable, but they are entirely diagnostic in nature. They shine a light on the problem, but do little to solve it. Unfortunately, economic sanctions are rarely effective. When they've been tried, they haven't worked. Governments are unlikely to change their religion policies because of sanctions alone. Additional policies are needed to supplement the leverage provided by sanctions or other negative incentives the United States might impose. State Department-funded programs are a good place to start, especially if those programs provide convincing reasons to the target nations why religious freedom is in their interests. Under former Religious Freedom Ambassador David Saperstein, program funding increased to $20 million a year. But even that amount pales in comparison to other programs intended to protect American national security. Unfortunately, the religious freedom programs that do exist, such as those mentioned by Ambassador Kozak, which are often splendid programs, are not part of a strategy, certainly not an all-of-government strategy. They're spread too thin. They're too ad hoc to have any appreciable impact on Islamist terrorism or to convince governments that religious freedom is in their interests. The unfortunate reality is that our religious freedom policy has been isolated from the mainstream of U.S. foreign policy. Until recently, it's been largely overlooked as a means of promoting stability and national security. Social scientists at the Religious Freedom Institute, where I work, are demonstrating something that America's founders understood instinctively. Religious freedom forms the basis of other human rights. It's necessary for the success of any society, especially highly religious societies. The evidence shows that religious freedom has a causal impact on social, political, and economic goods, such as long-term political stability, economic growth, and undermining religion-related violence. Societies that lack religious freedom are far more likely to incubate, experience domestically, and export internationally religion-related terrorism. The reverse is also true. Societies that protect religious freedom generally do not incubate or export violence and terrorism. Several Muslim-majority states in West Africa, for example, have avoided the violent extremism that plagues other Muslim states. Each has significant legal protections for religious freedom of Muslims and non-Muslims. The result is a stabilizing religious pluralism that discourages religious extremism. Let me conclude with some practical recommendations. Religious freedom policy can advance U.S. national security by focusing less on rhetorical enunciations and combining practical incentives with convincing self-interest arguments. For example, the State Department recently announced the withholding of $290 million in aid to Egypt because of its harsh restrictions on religious communities and other human rights violations. This is a good start, but unlikely to change things on the ground. Egypt is not going to change its religious freedom policies for $290 million. The U.S. should also provide the Egyptian government with hard evidence that their repressive laws and policies that altering their repressive laws and policies will benefit Egypt, for example, by reducing the violent extremism that is harming the country's all-important tourist industry. Iraq provides another opportunity. Since 2014, the U.S. has allocated nearly $1.7 billion in humanitarian aid to Iraq, but most of that aid has not reached the Christian minorities designated by us as victims of ISIS genocide. This is a U.S. national security problem as well as a humanitarian problem. Religious pluralism is a necessary condition for long-term stability in Iraq. If minorities do not return and stay, Iraq will likely become a perpetual Shia-Sunni battleground where terrorism flourishes. Success in these efforts will not come easy, Mr. Chairman, but the long war against Islamist terrorism cannot be won with law enforcement and military force alone. America needs new ideas and new combatants to win this war, and religious freedom should be part of the mix. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brzezinski, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having me here today to testify. I work in an organization whose mission is to foster American global leadership on human rights, including religious freedom, not just as a moral obligation, but also as a vital national interest. I bring this perspective to today's hearing and hope it will inform discussion this morning in at least 3 ways. First, it's important to recognize that the U.S. government's work to ensure that foreign governments do not encroach on an individual's rights to freedom of religion and conscience will be less effective if these efforts are divorced from work to uphold other fundamental freedoms. As several have mentioned, a review of the U.S. government's list of countries of particular concern bears out this fact. In no state is religious intolerance an outlier to a more widespread pattern of abuses. Simply put, repressive governments tend to seek control over any organized body of individuals and to view those outside of the government's direct control as a threat to their power. Thus, attacks on religion and belief often relate to, and sometimes stand in for, attacks on political opposition, human rights activists and lawyers, as Ms. Arriaga mentioned, on women, on LGBT people, and on ethnic minorities. This fact is worth bearing in mind as this committee considers the administration's ability to promote religious liberty and reduce attacks on religious communities. As this committee is no doubt aware, the administration's budget request of $37.6 billion to fund the State Department and USAID for fiscal year 2018 is roughly 30% lower than that which Congress appropriated for fiscal year 2017. The request for human rights-related work, which includes funding dedicated to international religious freedom, seeks to cut even deeper. While both the House and Senate to date have largely rejected these draconian cuts, the fact that they were both proposed in the first place should raise questions. The administration deserves credit for nominating a distinguished public servant for the position of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Yet the White House has yet to announce a nominee for the positions of Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, or nominees to lead the bureaus of East Asian and Pacific Affairs and Near Eastern Affairs, among others. These are areas of ongoing, gross abuses against religious minorities, and we deserve to have appropriately credentialed leaders focusing on them daily. Secretary of State Tillerson recently wrote that while he intends to retain the position of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom and place other envoys under this position, he did not plan to have the Ambassador at Large report directly to him, which in my analysis does not appear to conform to the Frank Wolf Act. The Secretary also indicated that he sought to eliminate other positions working to advance religious tolerance. This includes the U.S. Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which was created during the Bush administration and has since performed a valuable, tangible function to increase protections for believers and non-believers alike. Additionally, the administration has elected, through its various travel bans and recent decision to cap the number of refugee admissions at an all-time low, to take steps that will be seen by audiences around the world is not in keeping with America's leadership role in promoting religious freedom and protecting the most vulnerable. This brings me to my second point, which is that among the greatest challenges to religious freedom today is that foreign governments are acting in the name of countering terrorism to repress their citizens. If we have seen from countries as diverse as Azerbaijan, Bahrain, China, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Tajikistan, governments are increasingly conflating peaceful religious expression with terrorist activity in order to justify repression. Not only do such laws and policies regularly threaten religious communities and other peaceful civic organizations, they often have the effect of advancing the very radicalization that they are ostensibly meant to confront. In the Middle East, these actions contribute to the heightened sectarian nature of the wars in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Countries including Azerbaijan, China, and Tajikistan have moved aggressively against members of peaceful political opposition groups and religious communities, often justifying their actions on dubious counterterrorism grounds. And as was mentioned in Russia, recently amended anti-extremism laws have established a legal framework that allows the state to curtail essentially all forms of peaceful dissent, as well as disfavored religious speech and practice. Concluding with a third point, I'd like to touch on an issue that deals with rising anti-Semitism in Europe, a trend that the U.S. government should do more to address head-on. Examples of anti-Jewish violence from members of Muslim communities in France and elsewhere, as well as recurring credible allegations of anti-Semitic statements by members of the UK's Labour Party, demonstrate that this is not a trend confined to a certain sector of European society or the political spectrum. That said, in countries ranging from France to Germany to Hungary to Poland, right-wing populist parties and governments are increasingly trafficking in and turning a blind eye to anti-Semitic rhetoric. They are thus engendering climates increasingly conducive to violence. In instances in which these parties have come to power, as in Hungary and Poland, they have embarked on a multifaceted effort to undermine the rule of law, weaken governmental checks and balances, and impair civil society. As these values underpin transatlantic security and prosperity, this should alarm us all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair notes the presence of our colleague, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Palmer be allowed to fully participate in today's hearing, and without objection, it's so ordered. The chair also had noted the presence of the full committee chairman, but I think he will grace us with his presence shortly. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Farr and Ambassador Kozak, you both touched on some of the discrimination against people in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Mr. Brzezinski had mentioned how sometimes the oppressing people based on religion can be a proxy for just political disagreements. But in Iran and Saudi Arabia, the root of the discrimination is just based on the Sharia-based society. I mean, the law is being applied to where if you're not of that particular persuasion, you are disfavored, correct?
Yes, I mean, I think both are true, that you're disfavored because you're not of that persuasion, but it's also people who want to maintain political power make themselves the interpreters of what is the applicable religious doctrine. So they play off each other to very bad effect.
Couldn't agree more. This is religious persecution, plain and simple. It's motivated by a religious view that certain religious opinions and groups are not acceptable. Ms. Arriaga has talked about these Baha'i in Iran, these women who have been in prison for 10 years for nothing more than being Baha'i. That's religious persecution par excellence, if I can put it that way.
So what, because you had mentioned some of the countries in Africa that don't have the same problems, what is the distinction between this? Because I noted, you know, the president of Egypt, al-Sisi, he gave a speech in front of some of the Islamic clerics, and he said, look, you can't have a faith that views its role to be at war with people who disagree with you. So he was, I think, trying to chart a course where, you know, you can have an Islamic-based society that doesn't necessarily do that. But what separates the Irans from the countries that, even though they have Muslim majorities, are not trying to discriminate against and it's not just non-Muslims. I mean, you got to be the certain type of Muslim if you're in Iran.
Precisely so, and I think the answer lies in the history of these countries, but it also, in these 7 West African countries, has to do with the fact that they've discovered this works. I mean, it produces more economic growth, it produces more political stability, people are killing each other less, people are freer. So some of this is just practical. And what I've called for is for us to be a little bit more down to earth in the way that we can convince governments that it's in their interest to allow greater religious freedom, or at least religious tolerance, move away from some of these crackdowns. Each government is tough, and you've named the 2 toughest, frankly, other than North Korea, Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are very, very difficult, but it doesn't mean we should not be really trying to make the self-interest argument to them, particularly in Iran, where you have, it seems to me, a large number of younger Iranian citizens who are generally pro-American. They're open to some of these messages, but if they speak out, they're going to get hurt. We need to address those problems too.
Well, I hope that, I mean, the practical point you make about the experience clearly is lost on the ruling elites in Iran, but hopefully throughout Iranian society, where I think you do have people who are much more pro-Western in terms of some of their values, that could be an impetus to eventually go in a different direction with that society, because, I mean, it's a totalitarian state. What about the suspension of the visas for people who are denying religious freedom? Ms. Arriaga, you mentioned it. It's in the law. I mean, my view is we ought to enforce that. I mean, if we're not going to force this stuff, then why are we even passing it? What has been done to do that? I mean, I think if we followed the law, it would be very difficult for people from Iran and Saudi Arabia to get visas to come here, but yet that happens.
We need to have a more comprehensive way to keep those lists. We know for a fact that there are thousands of the children of human rights violators around the world that come here to go to school and go to college here, and the Wolf Act precisely is asking for a more comprehensive list of violators, as well as a more comprehensive list of conscience prisoners. So making sure that we have the correct information is a good place to begin.
Ambassador Kozak, what's the answer?
Yes, no, we've found that visa denial is a very effective tool, whether it's for human rights violations generally or religious freedom violations in particular. One of the complications of making lists is that there are multiple bases for denying people visas, and the consular officers tend to take the easiest one. So if you have someone who has committed extrajudicial killings or torture, they're banned anyway. It's part of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So they don't need to go to the question of did they do this for religious reasons or did they do this for human rights reasons. So it makes compilation of lists a little bit complicated, but it's a very effective tool, and we've deployed it, I think, to great effect in a number of places. And
thank you. My time is up, and I will recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. let's take this from a sort of a 30,000-foot level. I know that President Trump has recommended a 30% cut in the State Department budget, and that's for State Department and also USAID. Well, let me put it in the words of a Republican Senator, Lindsey Graham. He described that move, cutting the budget by 30%, as, quote, radical and reckless. Ms. Arriaga, your feelings on that?
The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom makes recommendations to the State Department, but we do not take a position on its budget. I'm sure Ambassador Kozak will be happy to address
Mr. Kozak,
the question.
she just threw you under the bus, but go ahead.
I support the President's budget request.
Oh, do you?
As any administration official or witness would.
Mr. Brzezinski, how about you?
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned a little bit in my testimony, I think overall the budget cuts are pretty reckless. I think that they were made out of the gate without appropriate understanding of the nature of diplomacy, the number of complex issues the State Department and USAID are working through. I think ultimately they're going to harm our ability to promote human rights and religious liberty as well.
Fair enough. So, Ms. Arriaga and Mr. Brzezinski, you both bring up the situation of Russia in your written remarks. As you both noted, last year, new Russian laws effectively criminalize all private religious speech not sanctioned, not approved by the Russian government, sort of a government filter on religious speech. Also, the Jehovah's Witnesses were banned in the North Caucasus, particularly in Chechnya and Dagestan. Security forces continue to carry out arrests and kidnappings of people suspected of any links to, quote, non-traditional Islam as defined by the government. So, Mr. Brzezinski, do you think that Russia's repression of the religious rights of its own people and those of neighboring countries is something that should be of particular concern to the United States?
I do. And I wouldn't limit it to just repression on religious grounds. In addition to all the things you mentioned, the Russian government is involved in a widespread focus on repressing any actor or organization that can pose a challenge to state control. So we see that in terms of journalists and opposition politicians murdered and imprisoned. We see it in terms of broad-based attacks on NGOs working on human rights and religious freedom, certainly, but also on issues of health and the environment, forcing dozens to close, many more tarred as foreign agents, as traitors, harassed, raided, and so on. We see a media landscape that at one point had a fairly free and fair media environment that's now essentially a propaganda machine directed and controlled by the Kremlin. We see it in terms of what should be described as pogroms against gay people in Chechnya, detaining them illegally, abusing them, and in some cases murdering them. So we see this repression across the board right now in Russia, and I think that we can draw a tie between the repression that the Russian government is enacting at home and its behavior abroad, some of which was mentioned earlier in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, the attacks on the Tatar Muslim minority population there. As we all know, the Russian government's involvement in Syria and the Russian government's involvement in both the U.S. presidential election and what seem to be continuing efforts to raise societal tensions in the United States and in countries across Europe. I think this is a continuing threat, and I feel that there is reason for the U.S. population to be concerned because the repression at home is tied to some of these behaviors abroad.
Thank you. Ms. Arriaga, in the most recent report that I have on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, they talk about what's going on in eastern Ukraine and also in Crimea. We don't hear a lot about that. What is going on? That report seems to lay out some very repressive activity.
Yeah, USEF continues to receive weekly reports of Putin's thugs acting with impunity. The Jehovah's Witnesses have even produced, for instance, videos of information being planted in their houses of worship. And unfortunately, in Ukraine and in Crimea, we have received reports of people being arrested arbitrarily and also being executed without a trial. John Ruske, a fellow commissioner, has adopted a Muslim political prisoner from Russia. He was accused of studying pacifist Islam. His name is Bagir Kasikanov. And we are advocating for individuals humanizing the story and also highlighting what's going on in Crimea and the Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Chairman Fox for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Ambassador Kozak, I believe the freedom-defending world can do more to prevent atrocity crimes if it can deter severe violations of religious freedom earlier on. The Frank Wolf Act amends the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act in several ways, including by creating the designated persons list and sanctioning mechanisms for non-state actors. Could you elaborate on how this provision of the Act could be used to address violations of religious freedom, particularly those committed by Burmese security forces, non-state actors, and other nationalist groups and individuals against the Rohingya minority facing ethnic cleansing?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The Act does give us some additional tools in being able to, I mean, obviously we have spoken out against non-state actors who've committed these gross violations, as Secretary Tillerson did with respect to the genocidal acts of ISIS in Iraq. And we have been able to speak out against individuals, but I think this will give us an opportunity or an impetus to put them together more methodically. The Rohingya situation today is just appalling. The attacks with security forces and also societal attacks have resulted at this point in half of the people in Rakhine State, half of the Rohingya leaving and living across the border in terrible conditions, murders, rapes, just every manner of atrocity committed against them. We have, as I think you know, been trying for years to find some way to throttle back people's behavior in this respect and appeal to the government, appeal to the Burmese military to stop it. But it's a little bit what the chairman said. People in power sometimes the argument as to what's in the best interest of the country doesn't resonate with them because it's not in their best interest as in terms of maintaining their own power. And trying to find the right combination of carrots and sticks to persuade them to do otherwise is difficult. But it's something that's got to be done. It's something we spend an awful lot of time and energy on, trying to find the right combination of programs, diplomatic activity, advice, pressure, and hopefully we will find a way to throttle it back, because it's a bad situation, or a terrible situation that's getting worse.
Thank you. Ms. Arriaga, I noted in your testimony you highlighted how religion has been used to disempower women, and that women and girls are often victims of religious freedom violations, extremism, and discriminatory personal status laws. Could you discuss the complexities and synergies between the rights of women and girls, freedom of religion, and what religious freedom advocates have been doing to address the issue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We at the Commission have issued a brand new report precisely on the synergies between religious freedom and women's rights. We find that countries that fully respect religious freedom also ban child brides. They also allow communities to reject harmful practices such as female genital mutilation. Women who are divorced are not forced into poverty. Women are not forced to convert to the religion of the person they're marrying. Marriages are recognized. It's been unfortunately, our experience that women's rights and religious freedom advocates were not working together. They thought that rights were pitted against each other. However, after we issued this report, we have met with a number of academics at Oxford. We have met a number of parliamentarians through the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion of Belief, and we have found there has been a great reception. We think we can double the advocates for religious freedom if we take in advocates for women's rights as well. Ultimately, human rights are interdependent. And to take one out of the equation arbitrarily or artificially hurts the rights of everyone else. And every single human right should be considered in tandem as cooperating and collaborating with each other.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gomez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was sworn into Congress, I said that one of my main duties was to fight for my constituents, no matter where they were from, no matter what God they worship, no matter the color of their skin. If they came here, they believed in our values, contribute to our country, that they deserved a place here in the United States of America. And freedom of religion and freedom of expression are the bedrock freedoms on which our country was founded. It is these freedoms that should give us the authority and the ability to do what we can to promote these freedoms with people around the world. It is the moral authority upon which our ability to promote international religious freedom rests. Unfortunately, religious freedom under this administration means nothing more than giving certain groups the license to discriminate against people of color, Muslims, people of a non-Christian faith, and the LGBT community. It is deeply disturbing to me that some people have used religious freedom as their basis to fire people who don't share the same religious beliefs or who are LGBTQ. Where I come from, that is just discrimination, plain and simple. There's no need to dress it up. I believe that this administration's repeated attempt at a Muslim ban, the normalization of racism by this Department of Justice, and the brazen attacks on the LGBT community undermine our moral authority and undermine our ability to promote religious freedom abroad. Quick question. Last week, Attorney General Sessions issued a directive to all federal agencies, which included the following guidance. To the greatest extent practical and permitted by law, religious observance and practice should be reasonably accommodated in all government activity. The Human Rights Campaign, a national LGBT rights group, called these guidelines a, quote, an all-out assault on civil rights and a, quote, sweeping license to discriminate. Mr. Brzezinski, do you believe that the rolling back of regulations protecting LGBT groups in the name of religion promotes religious freedom?
Thank you, Congressman. What I would say in response to that is that I think that the protections for religious freedom that are enshrined in the First Amendment do not and should not give broad license to discriminate against any class of people. So with the understanding that some of the memoranda that the Department of Justice have put out are long and complex, just came out and have yet to be fully analyzed, I would say that I would hope that the Department of Justice would act fully in keeping with that spirit.
Thank you. Commissioner Arriaga, you mentioned that some people use discrimination and against other religions as a way to promote their own self-interest. Have you seen any of that here in our country recently? You don't have to answer that question. Let me ask you one other question. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom does not review repression of religious freedoms in the United States. How would the banning of a particular religious group affect your analysis of religious freedoms in this country?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
How would the banning of a particular religious group affect your analysis of religious freedom in this country?
Mr. Gomez, my name is Cristina Arriaga. As a fellow Latina, I think I know a little bit of what you're talking about in terms of discrimination. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom advocates for all religions in every single country. We find that banning one religion or granting preference to one or the other is generally not in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18.
Great. Mr. Brzezinski, according to a recent report by the Council of American Islamic Relations, there has been a, quote, 91% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes during the first half of the year compared to the same period in 2016. Would a 91% increase in a foreign country over a 6-month period raise concerns for you?
Yes, absolutely it would.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I'm trying to highlight is that our ability to promote religious freedom abroad rests on how people view how we promote that same freedom in our own country. Anything that undermines it makes our ability less so, and then weakens our ability to protect religious freedom of individuals in other countries. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman, Mr. Russell, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, and I also thank the Chairman for holding this important hearing. I think it's vital not only to obviously how we treat all human beings, but also it intertwines in so much of our foreign policy and our relations around the globe in making sure that these differences and these pretexts do not become a thing that divide and ultimately result in the slaughtering of thousands of innocent people, which seems to be the trend of history. And Mr. Chairman, I guess I would like to speak a little bit about, having extensively traveled the globe and fought in several different places around it, while some of our colleagues may imagine that we have such religious oppression in this country, this is one of the greatest nations that we have as far as religious tolerance. Differences in religious opinion, sure, protected by the First Amendment also. But those opinions being forced upon religious groups to force them to violate their rights of conscience, which are also protected in the First Amendment, we can't use one group's pretext or agendas to violate the religious beliefs of another group. And in that, I think the United States does very well. As I look at this list of the CPC recommendation nations, there's a trend that I find kind of interesting. 60% on the recommended list are Asian countries. And we often focus on, the habitual troublemakers, that we become accustomed to. But we're seeing 60% in Asia, 25% in Africa, and 15% in the Middle East. And I find that intriguing because oftentimes we don't make the type of investments in Asia, and yet this is where we're seeing, just on the CPC list, interesting trend. Along that line, too, on the Tier 2 countries, 2 key allies of the United States are on this list. One, a NATO ally, which is of particular concern. And Ms. Arriaga, you intrigue me with your visa restriction, but extend that to the education piece, which I think would be useful. But as I try to walk through that, one of the successful programs that we have is the International Military Exchange Program, IMET. And in decades past, we're kind of darned if we do and darned if we don't. If we try to promote human rights through the education of military officers, most of which will grow up to be major commanders and generals in that nation, and you would hope would be trained in our values, they can actually do some good. On the other hand, if you exclude them, then they will not be exposed to any of those Western things. And one of the things we see with Turkey right now, as they continue to oppress, is even ferreting out those that have been trained in Western countries, particularly the United States, out of their military, and that causes great alarm. So I've stated several observations here, and I would like kind of your commentary on that, and anyone else that would like to opine on some of these observations and what concerns you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I just came back from Turkey 3 days ago. The situation there is extraordinary. There is an enormous amount of stress and anxiety on the Turkish people, on the minority religious communities. As you know, Pastor Brunson has been incarcerated. It's been a year last Saturday. And regrettably, as you also know, 24 hours before Yusuf's arrival to Turkey, a DEA officer who's a Turkish national was arrested. So I think right now Turkey stands as a NATO ally who's having great difficulties respecting human rights in
Which is part of the NATO Charter, by the way. It's embedded in that alliance. Do you see resistance in calling out Turkey in these tier 2 countries, or even maybe an elevation other? Are you getting pushback on that?
Well, Yusuf continues to be greatly troubled by the recent developments, and unfortunately, when we see such a bad panorama for human rights in general, for all the journalists getting arrested, generally religious freedom also falls in the same category. We met with several religious communities in Turkey that still have no legal persona. Turkey has spent a great deal of the summer revising its textbooks. There is a mandatory religious education which characterizes anyone from a minority religion as being outside of the spectrum of many times acceptable behavior that is very traumatic for children. So we will continue to watch closely what's going on.
Well, thank you for that, and I would love to hear from the others, but unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank each of our panelists for being here this morning and for the role that each of you play in defending religious liberties around the world, regardless of what that religion may be. My background is that of a pastor for about 25 years before being in Congress, and I personally have seen a lot of what you deal with, and this has been an area of great concern for mine for a long time. And I appreciate the fact that y'all are on the tip of the spear in trying to deal with this and keep us informed. Religious liberty is a universal right, not just something that we cherish here in America. Should be something that is cherished around the world, regardless, again, of what the religion may be that is held by an individual. We've brought up today already some in the Muslim communities, be it in places like Burma or Russia or the Middle East, even where the Yazidis. I mean, we're seeing that. But one area of concern for me, not so much with your work, but it seems, at least with the media and otherwise, that is largely missing is a persecution of Christians around the world that seems to largely go unnoticed. And I recall in November 2012 that from Germany, Merkel made the comment that Christianity was the most persecuted religion in the world. And of course, that statement was met with a great deal of criticism, but it's backed up. And there have been many reports, as you well know, of the plight that Christians are facing in many places around the world. And goodness, we can even look at some of the various laws of apostasy that many countries have, where if someone converts to Christianity, the punishment can be extremely severe and torturous. And many of these countries you've mentioned, from Saudi Arabia to Iran, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. North Korea, we're seeing some horrible stories coming out of North Korea. China, in fact, I have a resolution to try to call China's hand on some of the catastrophes happening there. And bottom line, we just can't allow these things to continue. They've got to be brought to the public's awareness and to be dealt with. So just a couple of questions within all that context. Ambassador, let me begin with you. When the State Department is considering which refugees are admitted to the United States, what role, if any, does the threat of religious persecution against an individual play in the determination as to whether or not they would be allowed to come to the United States as a refugee?
Thank you, sir. It's key. The definition of a refugee is somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on religion or political opinion. There are several categories, ethnicity, but religion is one of them. So to qualify as a refugee, if you say, I have a well-founded fear of persecution, that is the key thing you have to show. In terms of deciding, you know, how to allocate our refugee numbers around the world, they tend to look at what are the most vulnerable populations, the most at-risk populations. And again, that can be based on people who are at risk because of their...
Do you believe that allocation is properly manifested when it deals with Christians around the world? I mean, we've got studies I've seen, some 200 million Christians around the world suffering persecution in one way or another.
Yeah, and you've got like now we're usually in the order of 75,000 or 50,000 refugee numbers per year to allocate. It really depends on the particular area. In some countries, I think we've had a high percentage of the refugees coming in have been Christians because Christians have been persecuted there. In others, you get...
Let me ask my final question. I've only got 20 seconds. What does Congress need to do to help achieve the goal of both awareness and of stopping religious persecution around the world? And I'll open that to anyone who would like to answer.
Well, I think you already have given us a tremendous amount of tools. The International Religious Freedom Report, which is mandated, and as Dr. Farr said, it's diagnostic, but that's where you start. And we try to do a good job of saying what is the problem in each one of these places. Then you have the second set of what do you do about it, and they're the tools that have been given, having an office with programming, having ambassador at large who can go around the world and try to raise awareness of these issues, having sanctions that we can apply, whether it's on visas or on economic assistance or military assistance or other things. Those are all the kinds of tools you would use for other diplomatic efforts, but it's putting the combination together, getting across-the-board effort from the government. I think one of the things that adds to that, though, is the efforts of individual members of Congress. People do pay attention when they hear you and your colleagues speak up on these issues because they know that decisions that affect them are made in Congress as well as in the executive branch, and it really amplifies the message we're trying to get across.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry.
Did you want to?
Yeah, if I may add, H.R. 390 has passed the House, is now in the Senate. In the Senate, it was amended to include assistance to the Syrian population. It would be terrific if this passed and there was more funding appropriated immediately for that, for genocide victims.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, did you want to ask questions?
If the chairman would allow.
I think I have no other choice but to allow.
Oh, but you do. I want to thank you for having this hearing, Chairman DeSantis, and for your commitment to religious freedom. Dr. Farr, it's good to see you again. I asked you a question during the last administration, and in the interest of fairness, I'm going to ask you the exact same question under this administration. Leave Congress out of it for a second. Just focus on the executive branch. What are the 3 things that you would change if you could at the executive branch level, given the fact that we have had a change in administration? What are the first 3 things that should be done from your perspective in this sphere?
Thank you, Mr. Gowdy. Speaking as a fellow South Carolinian, one of those things has already been done, and that is that this goes to something Mr. Lynch asked about earlier, and that is the budget cuts in the State Department. I agree with Mr. Brzezinski that this was a bad idea, but one of the good things that has happened, in my view, is that the Office of International Religious Freedom has become larger. And so long as the positions that are being moved in there are being moved with the funds to support them, which I think is the case, but I'm not sure. As long as that is the case, that is a good thing. So what I'm talking about is more staff and more oomph for the Office of International Religious Freedom. The second thing, the Wolf Act requires, and that is that the ambassador at large report to the Secretary of State. Now, as already been mentioned here, I forget who mentioned it, it may be my colleague to the left, thank you for mentioning it. In the same letter where Secretary Tillerson moved these or proposed moving these positions under the ambassador at large, he said he's going to report to a lower ranking official. Well, this is pretty clear in the law. The ambassador at large shall report to the Secretary of State. Why is that important? Is that a magic wand? No, it's not. It, in fact, however, improves the status of the ambassador at large in the office, in my opinion, for the governments out there, and just as importantly, for American diplomats who have seen historically this position as sort of a, just below high level, let me put it that way, within the State Department. I think it's very important, and Congress should, in my view, insist that the ambassador report to the Secretary of State. But the final thing, the third thing, Mr. Gowdy, is the subject of my testimony today, and that is that the international religious freedom policy of the United States is not yet aligned with our national security policy. It's not an all-of-government thing. It is still focused in a single office with not enough oomph to do this. This may be changing under this administration. There may be something in the national security strategy of the United States when it's produced that draws religious freedom in, as I think it should be. But that is a major, major remaining step to take, in my opinion. Thank you for the question.
Yes, sir. You touched upon what I find to be a fascinating dualism in your opening statement, that our national security interests are actually advanced when countries have more enlightened policies with respect to religious liberty. I like to anticipate arguments on the other side, and sometimes the other side, I don't mean Democrats, I mean the other side of this issue, sometimes folks on the other side, which are both Republicans and Democrats, will make the argument that we need to be more patient with the following countries because they are of such significant national security interest that we should overlook the following things. You made the exact opposite argument, and I want to give you a chance to extrapolate on that.
Well, thank you. It's pretty broad without focusing on a particular country, but the ones where this happens, such as Saudi Arabia, that's a very good example of where we need the support of the Saudis. We need cooperation, intelligence, military, otherwise. And yet, it is the mother lode of Islamist extremism. It is the place where the ideology that energizes Islamist extremism begins. We need to do both. There is no simple answer to any foreign policy question, let alone one that has to do with religion. I think we are deficient in providing to the Saudis reasons why it's in their interest to begin not to adopt the First Amendment or move toward religious freedom in the broad way that we view it here, but toward religious tolerance, because it can begin to benefit them. And in fact, we have opportunities. The regime itself talks a very good line internationally when it talks about its approach to their own religion. We should be working, and we are working, but I think we treat this almost as a boutique issue. We don't have enough resources working with the Saudis behind the scenes to convince them it's in their interest. The same would be true of Iran. It would be true of China. It would be true of any country where I believe we can make this an all-of-government effort to convince them it's in their interest. That's a broad answer to a broad question. I hope I'm being responsive.
You did. Thank you, Dr. Farr. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chair now recognizes Mrs. Demings for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, to our ranking member as well, and to our witnesses. Thank you for being with us. According to a United Nations official, the Burmese government has been carrying out a, quote, ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, an ethnic group, as you all know, that primarily belong to the Muslim faith. According to the United Nations, 500,000 civilians fled from Burma to Bangladesh since August 25, 2017 alone. Commissioner, can you please speak to how the Burmese government is essentially attempting to erase the Rohingya from Burma?
We at USERV have monitored that situation with great concern. We received reports that some of the Rohingya Muslims were even walking barefoot over barbed wire to try to get to Bangladesh and flee. And in fact, USERV is planning to have a delegation go to Burma and Bangladesh in the next few weeks precisely to address this issue. It is, without a doubt, an incident of ethnic cleansing without precedent in that country.
Burma has been listed as a country of particular concern by the State Department for over a decade. Commissioner, again, has Burma's appearance on the State Department's countries of particular concern list had any effect on the regime's persecution of religious minorities?
It's hard to tell. The developments in the last few weeks have, again, been unprecedented. We have watched them with great concern, and every single voice needs to rise to defend the Rohingya Muslims.
Dr. Farr, what do you believe the United States can do to stop the, quote, ethnic cleansing that is occurring?
Well, I frankly prefer to call it religious cleansing. I mean, these are Muslims, and this is religious persecution of the first order. And you're quite right. They've been on the list for over 10 years. I was in the Office of Religious Freedom when these lists were created by the law and began to implement them. So I think it's actually been longer than 10 years. And while I would never suggest that these lists are not important, I said in my testimony they're vitally important, they're just lists. They're just pieces of paper that list a bunch of countries on them, and where we say we're looking at economic sanctions. As far as I know, there's only been one set of economic sanctions. I could be wrong about this, and Ambassador Kozak can correct me, but the last time I paid attention to this, there was only one country in the world that we had ever imposed new economic sanctions on because of the 20-year-old International Religious Freedom Act, and that, as I recall, was Eritrea. And to say the very least, it didn't work, and that was part of my reason for arguing my testimony, that we need more than words, and we need more than sanctions. So whatever we've tried in Burma has not worked. I think we have an opportunity now not only to condemn them, which we should be speaking out. We need Ambassador Brown back in that position so that he can go to Burma and speak about this, which I think he will. But we also need to begin to work with the Burmese to get in front of this problem, because it'll happen again. And the fact that they're on this list won't make a bit of difference in the world, in my opinion.
Last week, while addressing the United Nations Security Council, UN Secretary General said this, and I quote, "The situation has spiraled into the world's fastest developing refugee emergency and a humanitarian and human rights nightmare." Mr. Brzezinski, should the United States enter into negotiations with Bangladesh to allow for a certain percentage of the displaced Rohingya to resettle in America?
Well, I wouldn't want to get out front of the United States' overall refugee resettlement program. As I understand it, and Ambassador Kozak can speak to this in more depth, there are, among other things related to U.S. efforts on resolving the crisis, intensive talks going on right now with the government of Bangladesh. But I think, to your larger point, perhaps, this speaks to the cap on refugee resettlement overall that the Trump administration has put in place. I would say that were I able to respond to Chairman Gowdy's question along the lines of what three things could this administration do to improve the plight of persecuted religious minorities of all kinds, raising that cap would improve the lives of Christians, Muslims, and others.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this very important hearing. Ambassador Kozak, the State Department's most recent report discusses a number of countries' failings on religious freedom. Many of those countries are a source of threats to the United States. But that list doesn't include non-state actors, does it?
The current list does not include non-state actors because those were added by the Wolf Act, which will kick in this year. So the list that will come out in next month, I guess at this point, will also include non-state actors.
So the list will. Does the State Department have any concern about including them on the list?
No, sir. It was simply that we were responding to the earlier mandate from Congress, and this is now broadened. In some ways, it actually helps to provide context, because in many of these places, the worst atrocities are being committed by non-state actors. Witness the genocide committed by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and it just didn't fit within the reporting mandate before, and now it does, and we're happy for it.
And you have the same thing with the Taliban and Boko Haram and those groups.
Right. Any group that we find is a group of particular concern with respect to committing the most serious acts of countering religious freedom.
Those are the hard, extreme cases of the violation of religious freedom. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir. The way it's defined in the Act is it's particularly severe violations such as torture, extrajudicial killings, long-term imprisonment without charges, use of rape against people. So it's not, you know, the unfortunately run-of-the-mill thing like refusing to register or provide legal status to a particular group, or even the bans on allowing groups to worship. This is where it gets violent, and people are being killed.
There's softer forms of religious persecution or violation of religious freedom that would include discriminating against who they could hire or who they could associate with. Would you agree that happens as well?
Oh, absolutely, sir.
Would you agree that that happens in the United States? We had one of our colleagues make some allegations along those lines. I'd just like to point out that, you know, and we're really focused on what goes on internationally, and I think appropriately so, but there's also violations that have occurred in the United States that violate an individual or a particular denomination or religion's right to free exercise.
Well, what we tend to say, sir, on violations internationally is that every country violates human rights, including the human right of international religious freedom, because countries are made up of humans. But the question is, what does a country do about it when that happens? Do we have appropriate laws? Do we have appropriate enforcement mechanisms?
Well,
and I think that's where we're proud of our own mechanism.
Here in the United States, we're not immune to that, Dr. Farr. We've seen that where Catholic charities and nonprofit groups and other groups have been taken to court over their refusing to hire people who don't practice their faith or who don't believe the things that they believe. Does that concern you?
It does. And to return to something that Mr. Gomez had said, and I completely agree with him, although I may not apply the same principle as he did, and that is that if we don't understand what free exercise of religion is and what it means in this country, how can we convince other people abroad that it's of value to them? And you're quite right, in my view, the free exercise of religion is what this means. It means the full equality of all religious groups and citizens in our country, and certainly the right of religious groups of all kinds to adhere to their most fundamental values and not be forced by government, whether at the state, local, or national level, to violate their consciences. So we do have a problem. We need to solve it.
And I think that's particularly true considering that it is in our Constitution as the First Amendment that our government will make no law prohibiting the free exercise. And I just want to point out, Mr. Chairman, that we're not immune to this. And there was a particular example of this, a Supreme Court decision that was a unanimous decision against the United States government, the previous administration, Hosanna Tabor v. EEOC, in which members of the Supreme Court, again, 9-0 decision. This was a case in which our government argued that a religious organization, a denomination, could not have the freedom to hire who they wanted to, who practiced their religion, shared their beliefs. And in a 9-0 decision, you even had a couple of justices call it extraordinary or amazing, including Justice Kagan. I just think we need to be aware of that as well. I yield back. Now, thank you again for allowing me to participate.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Welch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panel for your testimony. In 2016, the U.S. envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation helped get us past the Marrakesh Declaration, which, as you know, affirmed the support of over 250 Muslim leaders for defending the rights of religious minorities in predominantly Muslim communities. Dr. Farr, what's your view of the Marrakesh Declaration as far as enhancing the national security of the U.S.?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Welch. I think the Marrakesh Declaration is a major step forward. It's realistic. It's not some pie-in-the-sky declaration of something that does not emerge from the heart of Islam. Sheikh bin Baya and the others who are behind this declaration, in my view, have constructed a modest but realistic declaration from the heart of Islam, which many Muslims agree with, that Islam is not a religion that has to put others at a disadvantage. Again, this is not a declaration of religious freedom as we would have it, but it does no good to have people put words out there that don't mean anything. So I am a big supporter of this because I think it is, in fact, precisely the kind of thing that our government should be behind, my Religious Freedom Institute is behind, and we are, in fact, working with these very people.
Thank you.
If I could just get this one more, I know we're running out of time.
Yeah.
This is, they recognize they have a problem.
Right.
And we need to help them solve that problem, not by wagging our finger or putting them on a list, but by helping them see and perform the duty that they already see for themselves, put it that way.
Right, and that's called diplomatic engagement. And I know Secretary Tillerson, among other things, is focusing on a reorganization of the State Department, and I think it's a fair concern for any new Secretary of State to try to figure out how best to organize the department and allocate its limited resources. But my understanding is that one of the proposals is eliminating the U.S. Special Envoy to the OIC. Ambassador Kozak, what's your view about the implications of that recommendation?
Well, first let me say that I've worked very closely with our previous ambassadors, representatives to the OIC, who have been housed in different places in the State Department over the last couple of administrations and even some switches during the last administration. I'm not going to predict where the Secretary is going to come out on the reorg plan, but my understanding is, or the redesign plan, but my understanding is that he wants to fold that function into the Office of Religious Freedom. It's currently part of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which in his letter, which is a straw man that he put out there for consultation with members, would merge. So I think the function of having somebody engaged with the OIC is one that is intended to continue. It's a question of how you place it bureaucratically, and that's a fair thing to be juggling.
Yeah, you know, you've had so much practical experience in this. There's a tension always in our foreign policy and in our State Department responsibilities. The realpolitik concerns of our engagement with another country sometimes are in conflict with our advocacy for basic values like religious freedom. And it would seem to me that the job of the Secretary, among other things, is try to balance those so that there's an ongoing engagement on outreach to protect the religious liberty of citizens around the world. So how would you recommend that we maintain that State Department commitment? It's got to be real. It's got to be people who are empowered, but it also has to coexist with other challenges that this country faces.
Yes, well, I think as many of the witnesses have said, and the chairman and other chairmen alluded to, the respect for human rights, including religious freedom, is vital to getting countries to where they can stand on their own and not generate giant security problems for the United States. And we've seen that over and over again. And as Dr. Farr points out, it's a question of how do you persuade them. Very difficult to persuade the leaders of a country that are bound and determined, who think their own status and power requires them to do repressive things. But that's where we try to first work with the society writ large. That's our Bureau. Almost all of our programming goes to working with non-governmental organizations to try to change societal attitudes, and through that to try to convince governments. You also have to get, it's great to have specialty offices like our own Bureau, like the Office of Religious Freedom, that can develop the arguments and so on, but you do need to spread those out so that they're being made, and this, I think, is the case in this area, that they're being made by our military officers when they're talking to their counterparts to say, hey, there's a smarter way to fight this insurgency than the way you're doing it. You need to, show greater respect for people's rights. You don't want to alienate people and so on. So it's pulling that all together. It's both within the department and interagency. It's absolutely crucial.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is to Mr. Brzezinski. In your testimony, you raised the important issue of rising anti-Semitism in Europe that is contributing to a climate of violence towards Jewish people in these countries. Do you believe that this trend has been exasperated by the continued opposition to the State of Israel that we see at various international organizations, particularly the United Nations? And how do anti-Israel campaigns such as the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, movement play into the current climate of anti-Semitism?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question and for raising the issue of anti-Semitism. I think there are a lot of different factors involved in what we're seeing in terms of anti-Semitism. My written testimony goes into this in some depth. I think that some of it is a matter of extreme governments that are coming into power and are interested in rolling back rights across the board in countries with histories of anti-Semitism, to include mass deportation and killing during the Holocaust. I think that there are elements related to Muslim communities in Europe and some of the anti-Semitic feelings that they bring. And to speak to your question directly, I also do think that there is a dynamic in which people are confusing opposition to Israeli government policies with it being appropriate to harbor discriminatory views against the Jewish population. So just like here in the United States, we can agree to disagree on various governmental policies, but one should never hold that against a religious or ethnic group.
Thank you. Next question, Ambassador. Does the State Department have any concerns with making non-state designations, and do you expect to declare non-state actors as EPCs going forward?
As to the first part of your question, and thank you for it, no, we have no problem with it. I mentioned earlier, I think actually it helps us because it's been difficult in the past to give context when some of the worst violations have been committed by non-state actors, but the report was only focused on state actors. So in that sense, it's helpful, and we look forward to it. As to whether and which organizations will be designated, I would say stay tuned. That's the Secretary's decision, and one that he involves himself in very personally. So we'll see that in due course.
Okay. Thank you. Let me follow up with this. The RFA also outlines 15 presidential actions that may be initiated toward any country found responsible for particularly severe violations of religious freedom. How many times since 1998 has the State Department recommended a presidential action be taken against a particularly bad religious freedom violator?
Thank you. I think we've had 11 countries over time that have been on the CPC list. The current 10, and Vietnam was on at one time. I believe in all but 3 of those countries, we have applied presidential actions. In some cases, they were waived, thinking Saudi in particular. As Dr. Farr alluded, though, oftentimes these are countries that have committed so many bad acts that we already have a wide array of sanctions against them. So sometimes putting them on the CPC list doesn't add an additional sanction. It double hats an existing sanction. But that can become important because when you go to start taking sanctions off in response to improvements in other areas, if they haven't improved on religious freedom, we're in the position of saying, look, we can't revoke that one until you make some improvements in this area. So the actions have been taken, but it is complicated by the fact that there are so many other aspects of the relationship that are also problematical.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank our witnesses again for appearing before us today. I thought it was a good hearing, and there was a lot of good stuff put on the record. The record for the hearing will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.